Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
We take from the thousands of business books out there and test the author's ideas by comparing them to real-world challenges. With over 40 years of projects between us, we've got quite a bit to compare against. We give you the condensed takeaways, followed by our interview with the authors.
We know you want actions, not theories, and it's actions that we want to help shape, because that's what the Wicked Podcast is all about, helping you to become a wicked company.
Marcus, it's 30 degrees centigrade outside. I am positively sweltering. How are things where you are?
My flat is a bit better, but I don't know why you're complaining. We have a bit of more summer left, and you can refreshen your tan that probably hasn't even faded from Portugal, where we went. I haven't been anywhere. I take any sun I can get in these dark times. So
All right. You're right. I should stop
whatever.
complaining. Yeah. But enough about our tans and the weather. Who are we talking to today?
Yes, so today we talk to Michael Wright, who's the co-author, together with David Espinola, of the book called The Exponential Era. And so they're looking at how the exponential aspect of the market and technology and those possibilities are impacting future companies and how to be more exponential as a company. So we had a good chat, but let's start with your takeaways.
So I think that it's one of these things that it continues to show up again and again and again is the value of experimentation. Trying different things in small, controlled, measured ways, and doing many, many, many small experiments. So whether we were talking about trying to deal with exponential change that's happening from megatrends in technology and technology collisions that are happening, or pandemics for that matter, or whether it's a traditional innovation process, just trying to keep the business fresh, the real value is in experimentation. And the other thing, and it was really interesting, it was in the first part of the book, he was talking about how important it is for business leaders to be able to spot things early and the skill of being able to spot things early. And I think that's something that can indeed be practiced. So my suggestion was for young business leaders, for young strategists, who may not be able to, be sitting at the C-suite level and having direct impact on multinational kind of corporations, start now. Start refining your skills of spotting different things. Make yourself a journal, make yourself a notebook of the things that you spotted and the questions that you asked, and build that skill because it will become valuable later.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, because sort of my takeaways are more about variance, and I'll lead back to that reference in about a minute. But what you're saying is, so the experimentation I found interesting because, with experimentation you can also ask whys, and so you experiment with the assumption that are thrown your way and see which ones are hold true, right? So that's one thing that can help you, and I'm really curious, and unfortunately we didn't quite get to that, but I'm always curious how experimentation can help not just the teams and delivery, but actually the leadership as well, to experiment with things and ideas and those markers to measure and assess those flags or those signals that are coming up. Because I think this will be a really, really big driver for direction in a company, because there's so many things to listen to. Which ones do actually matter? How do you do that? Well, you probably have to experiment as well on the leadership level as much as you do in the team and when you produce solutions, right? So that might be an interesting separate conversation. However, the main point I'm taking away from this, because I was quite happy that we talked again about Six Sigma, and I remember us talking about it in our first episode, where it was pointed out that Six Sigma has removed variance, and variance are sort of experiments today, right? So back in the days when Six Sigma was so successful, you reduced everything to like just this one thing that you can replicate and do the same, and everything's super, super controlled. But today, we don't have that. We actually need to experiment 1,000 times in order to see which one nudges it a bit higher, where we can grow the value. And we need to experiment that. We can't just go for one thing anymore because it's just too expensive and it's too high risk, and we have to do 1,000 small things. Now, the interesting thing Michael then said is like, well, Six Sigma is great for a particular context. And the way that he described the context is pretty much a tame problem context, where you know enough about something. Let's say you throw two chemicals together, or you're producing semiconductors. It's a very physics-driven environment that you can control and know enough about it. And there it works perfectly well. Six Sigma is still good for this. It produces amazing results. But for something where you have a million people involved that all interact with each other, it just doesn't work. You can't know enough about this. And therefore, you can't create the same efficient solution for it. You have to go for effectiveness because you're dealing with a wicked problem. So actually, you can say efficiency, yeah, go for it if you're dealing with the tame problem. Effectiveness, go for it if you deal with a wicked problem. Because we will not have time in a wicked problem scenario to go for efficiency. By the time you're efficient enough with one process, the world has moved on and it's doing something else. So I found that a really interesting sort of differentiator, very clear between those two things and what the two different mindsets really are. And that was my big one out of this one.
Yeah, I think those are both really kind of much more grounded. Mine were kind of more kind of fluffy, if you will. But I think that at the end of the day, what we're always trying to do for our listeners is to give them actionable insights that they can actually kind of dig into. And having said that, should we go to the interview?
Yes, we should. Good morning, everyone. Today we have Michael Wright, who is the co-author of the book, The Exponential Era. Good morning, Michael. How are you doing?
Good morning, Marcus. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So, fascinating book. Let's start by tell us a little bit about yourself and why you wrote the book.
Well, there's a couple things. I spent about 30 years chasing Moore's Law as a supplier and innovator, developer, inventor, entrepreneur, and a CEO of companies that supplied the semiconductor industry. And the semiconductor industry is built on, as I said, Moore's Law. Moore's Law basically is an exponential law. It says that the density of a chip will increase or double in the same area every 18 months. And that gets interesting because that is truly the definition of exponential, something that over time really begins to accelerate in volume and velocity. And so when we got kind of done with that career, we started looking around and said, well, what can we apply our knowledge to? We've chased this thing on a global basis at scale. How can we, leverage that knowledge into something useful? And we said, well, the biggest thing is it's counterintuitive to most people in terms of planning. And so we kept looking and looking and looking, and we found some things that had worked for us and that had worked over time, and said, well, gee, that's interesting, but most people can't even spell exponential. Maybe we ought to start with what is exponential and then kind of go from there and show all the markers about an exponential era. And so that led us to write the book. And the other was just that CEOs just seemed to be really confused about what to do next. A lot of them felt that reacting to something exponential was to go faster. And it's counterintuitive, actually, to intercept a exponential curve, you have to start earlier. So that's really why we wrote the book. We just felt people were sort of struggling with how fast things were moving and what do I do next? So we thought we'd help.
So mhm. I think that's, when we talk about exponential or we talk about the future or what's next and how things are further changed through technology or general behavior and change of the world, and we definitely live in very changing times. Uncertainty always comes up, and I think as much as exponential is sort of one of the terminologies that is been around now for a little bit. Uncertainty is always in there, and when something grows exponentially, it can be quite scary if there's an uncertainty attached to it. So can you comment a little bit of if there's a dynamic between that or what uncertainty means within an exponential era?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Marcus. I think, the difference between a leader and a manager is a manager is paid to direct the activities of today and to make sure that specific execution happens. A leader has to think about the unknown, and he has to make, by default, he's making decisions about the future. And the future is, as we know, unknown, and that gets to the uncertainty piece. So how do you get comfortable with the uncertainty? And I think the challenge is for most leaders in today's world, the uncertainty changes really quickly. Things move from point to point. All kinds of new things and new technologies converge to create new ecosystems. Those ecosystems disrupt the current one and go off at a fairly fast pace. So the challenge is, where are the inflection points? What can you be looking at to begin to get comfortable with where it might go, all the while understanding that it can potentially change while you're in the process. So the uncertainty piece, I think, is just built in as an element. Um, and as I wrote in my first book, The New Business Normal, leaders have to get comfortable with acting on inklings. How soon do you see it? How quickly you can sort of gauge it and respond to it. And let me give you one example of where the uncertainty sort of creates a challenge for industry leaders in certain industries. So let's take the example of taxi companies and Uber. So how long do you think it took Uber to take about 40% market share? Just, just a guess.
Well, it took less than 2 years.
14 months.
Yep.
Okay. So think about what's happening in a boardroom at a taxi company when Uber starts, showing up and coming. The first quarter is, who are these guys? The second quarterly meeting is, wow, these guys are moving fast. The third quarter meeting is, what are we doing? And the fourth quarter meeting is, does anybody know how we deal with bankruptcy? That's really fast when you compare it to, other transitions and other technologies. So the uncertainty piece has two legs to it. One is, what is going to happen? And two is, how fast is it going to happen?
And I think the other thing that's interesting about this is what earlier signals, and you talk about that quite a lot in the book, but what earlier signals, even pre-Uber, could they have spotted that maybe they missed, that were the inklings of what was about to happen?
I think that is probably one of the biggest dilemmas that management has, because we always used to call it thinking outside of the box. Well, how about thinking when there is no box?
Mm.
Where it's ill-defined as to where the competitive threats are going to come from. So, as one of the examples that we talk about in the book is taking a sort of go way outside of your normal purview and begin to think, well, what happens if? So one of the things that we really promote is experimentation. Looking at, and first of all, doing your homework, go out and do some real serious horizoning, looking out there and seeing what's there, what's possible. One question that as a CEO, I always used to ask myself and teams is, if the customer could not get the product or service from us or our competitors, what would they do? In other words, there's an orthodoxy in play, right, within an industry. If you go back and you look at Starbucks as an example, I believe they wrote on a napkin at one time $4.50 for a cup of coffee when coffee was selling for 50 cents.
At Dunkin' Donuts.
Right. So there's a willingness, and there has to be a willingness on the part of governance, on the part of the culture, to allow the company to experiment. The problem is, a lot of companies experimented at way beyond the scale that they should be experimenting. They should start in small ones and go from there. But that's how to get comfortable with sort of the uncertainty piece, but also to gear yourself up to start looking way ahead of the possibilities, and look at what might evolve in the way of technologies. So one of the things that we also talk about is the convergence of technologies, and I mentioned that before. When you have converging technologies, you have the ability to disrupt, and most of the time, most of the solutions today are multidiscipline. They're not single discipline, right? You don't make a pacemaker and not have software and security involved.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to look at, well, what else is converging to sort of change the dynamics in my industry? And I think that's true no matter what it is. Whether it's a commodity, you might be there looking at rapid extraction, or you might be looking at automation. There are other things that are going to come into play in the commodity world, to continue to lower cost, and to where you finally reduce the friction um, in terms of the physics idea of taking a raw material or an activity and making the delivery of it seamless and timeless in terms of the customer. So as each of those things evolve, the question becomes, how do you take steps out? How do you go faster? And what might enable that that's out there that you haven't considered before?
So can I go off on a bit of a segue here?
Yeah.
Many years ago, I was told that I should really kind of stop worrying, and they gave me an example of a method called the worry box. And they said, what you do is you create a little box, leave it on the corner of your desk or in your bedroom or wherever, and every time you're worried about something, write it down on a scrap of paper, fold it up, and put it in the worry box. And you're not allowed to take anything out until at the end of a year. And after a year, you sit down, you take the worry box, you open it, and you pull each one of those things out, and you realize pretty quickly you've got a body of evidence that says, wow, that never happened. Wow, that turned out it was actually a good thing. Wow, that did happen, but it was okay in the end. And you build a body of evidence. Is there any benefit or value to young leaders, to young strategists, whatever, to creating themselves basically a spotting box of I spotted this or I saw this or whatever, and start capturing those trends, and then after a year look back and say, oh, that one was right. I saw that. I didn't see that. I didn't see that. And giving themselves some level of expertise or practice in doing these things?
Well, it's a really good illustration, and I think it has value. It depends on the time horizons that you're looking at. Um,
Sure, that makes sense.
so there is a context there. In the case of something like Moore's Law, you got 18 months. You can't wait a year. Um,
Right.
so one of the things that you're doing in that process is validating your assumptions. And one of the challenges, I think, is everybody makes decisions based on assumptions. You have
Mm-hmm.
to assume that something is true. Well, how do you validate that it's true? Right? How do you know it's a fact? Well, one way you know it's a fact is when there's no more questions. So the challenge becomes, can I ask enough questions? Can I get to the point where my assumption set is reasonably validated that I can say, I should consider whatever this is. There are other times when you run into hard stops where there's invention in the path of progress, where you realize you're going to have to invent a solution. And then you have to start looking at, well, I better start the experiments early and figure out, which one of these might potentially work. The worry
So
box,
when you
go ahead.
mhm. So when you say you're running a lot on assumption, I think that's absolutely true, and I really like it because I see that from a service design perspective. Where when we're looking at that, what you call design thinking or sense making, right? You're going into exactly that as a principle, and you say treat literally everything an assumption, even the problem you think you might have, and you start asking questions into it to validate it. The thing I found in a lot of companies, unfortunately, is that the questions or treating things as an assumption is often really not done. A lot of things are being taken as facts or as good enough, or that there's seemingly evidence, and the evidence is not necessarily based on good data. And regardless, you have a lot of projects, a lot of investment going into those things with assumptions, and the assumptions never get checked until something's built and is put into reality, and then it often crashes with reality, or there's always a really high risk with it, and a lot of things fail. There's a massive amount of transformation projects that fail because of that, because people don't test the assumptions. So what could you recommend to businesses or leaders to say, right, how could you enable a context where assumptions are more tested? Because oddly enough, I found it not to be that widespread in companies because there's such a focus on just create a solution, just fix it, just do something tomorrow, rather than ask more questions.
Wow. That's really, there's a lot packed into that, Mark. I said, the fundamental piece is culture. The cultural attitude and the biases that people bring towards a particular industry or domain creates a bunch of orthodoxies. And one of the things you have to do is challenge those orthodoxies. Why do we believe what we believe? Why does the industry believe what it believes? what are the underlying assumptions, and challenging those assumptions, it gets to be a cultural issue in terms of, is it safe to challenge? That leads to another one, which is it safe to fail? Uh, so the companies that are whose cultures are more restrictive, shall we say, in terms of allowing failure, have a tendency to not challenge their own assumptions. They have a tendency to just, well, hey, here's what happens in the industry. We've been at this X number of years. We know better, blah, blah, blah. In the world that I come from, in the semiconductor industry, the last node may or may not have elements that work in the next node. So you get very comfortable with, moving away from a sort of a pre-existing or pre-assumed solution. And I think that's a cultural issue. It's also bounded by the context of the industry that they're in. What's challenging today, and why we called it the exponential era, is because digital transformation, convergences of technologies are impacting all industries. Nobody's immune. And that means you're going to have to look at how things are changing, what new ecosystems might develop, and where is your position in them. And the only way to do that is go out and take a look and throw away your assumptions and your orthodoxies.
And I think when we talk about failure, and we talk about failure quite a lot on here because it's one of our favorite things to talk about, is the fear of failure, the culture of failure, failure in regards to it's not failure if you've learned something and if you've kind of moved the organization along. And what I'm talking about, what I'm hearing you talk about, is also related to another major topic for us, which is about innovation. And a lot of people think, oh, we want to be innovative. We want to do innovation. So we're going to hire a marketing agency with brightly colored beanbags and all things like that. And what they really want are ideas, or they want minor process improvements, but they don't actually want radical innovation, because that's kicking the machine. That's kicking the existing business model. That's disrupting their existing business. And you're right, that the culture of the organization has to be such that that's welcome before that's going to happen.
Well, we always used to say, if you're not disrupting, you will be disrupted. And I think that's all that's happened is that pace is accelerating. I mean, if you look at what we're dealing with, it's really the outgrowth. Again, I come back to Moore's law, but the computing power has continued exponentially, along with the density and capabilities of chips to process information and computation. So we're now looking at installations like Aurora, which is a DARPA Intel Cray computing capability. So think about this: 10 followed by 18 zeros, right? Computations per second. That's mind-boggling. We've never had that on this. Human beings have never played with that stuff before. Look at what's happening with quantum and quantum computing. So there's a number of things on the horizon that, again, just continue to accelerate it. The challenge that you have is how and where do you intercept it? How do you play? How is that all relevant to my business? And that's the part where the process that we've put in place, the SPX process, is to just go out. Well, first thing you do is take a look. What else is out there? But get outside of your own comfort zone. What other things could come into play? If you're in a logistics business and you're not looking at 3D printing in autonomous vehicles, you're probably going to get disrupted. The question is when, how fast, where will it insert itself? Who's already doing it? One of the things that we do and we help our clients with is we work with a company that uses AI to search the USPTO.
Mm-hmm.
And what we look for.
So what's the USPTO?
U.S. Patent Office.
Yes.
U.S. Patent and Trademark Office.
Yes.
Yeah.
So doing that, we can literally look at millions of patents in a very short period of time and look for correlations and look for, key convergences. So in that particular instance, we did find that people were looking at 3D printing inside of autonomous vehicles, right? and filing patents around delivery systems, around security codes, around developing products. So you think about how that can potentially change that entire industry, and how it'll change the supply chain, which I hate that word. It's again, that's one of those that's almost an oxymoron, right? Supply is a very narrow definition of resources, and chain is literally rigid.
Mm.
So how do you get resiliency out of that?
Yeah, and I do a lot of work
So
in
so we
blockchain, which is about transparency of that supply chain, which is another whole dimension.
Yeah, I prefer
so
to
we're
use
talking.
the term possibility networks, right?
Yeah,
Integrating your
we talk a lot.
possibility networks.
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about technology, which for obvious reasons here, because we've seen a lot of that exponential growth in through to technology, in particular software technology more than hardware, because hardware is physically more limited than software. However, especially when we look at big companies from all the big ones, really, like we look at Apple, Amazon, Uber, Facebook, Twitter. They're a lot driven by people and their behavior as well, right? So the whole idea of being able to connect people together in a very, very different way, exponentially so, has created a dynamic that is often can go both ways, and we really know that now. And there were maybe some markers there on the horizon some time ago, and some people were warning about it, but not everyone was listening. So now we have a bit of a dilemma there. If we're looking at technology, often I think we can find and maybe agree that often it's a bit of a what's called a garbage in, garbage out system, where the technology itself is pretty neutral, and depending how you use it, what you're feeding it with, you will have different things coming out at the other end. So what do you see in terms of exponential value or that kind of dynamic when you have companies who say, right, okay, I want to go into tech, I want to collect tons of data. I've seen a lot of companies doing exactly that, and then collecting data as much as they can without really knowing why. And that doesn't make necessarily good data, and therefore that doesn't necessarily make good output. What would you say to companies like that who want to invest in those technologies and use it? How can they focus? How can they focus around what's really beneficial for them with any given technology?
There's a lot in there. There's an ethical piece to it, which I'll try and come back to later. But there's
Let's look at it from a qualitative aspect rather, I think, or from a value aspect. Not we don't have to talk the politics and ethics, let's say, of Facebook or at this moment. But I would
no,
say
I wasn't going to go there.
that's
It's more. It's
don't have that kind of time.
it's a deeper.
But really talking about, for example, I worked for a big marketing agency, and they talked about a single customer view dashboard system ecosystem they wanted to build, and so they tried to collect as many data points as they could find. A lot of them were pretty useless for most of the things they were trying to do. So they was wasting a lot of time on this. So how can companies more focus on what they might actually need when they want to buy these new technologies in?
I think you start with one question: what problem are we trying to solve?
Mm-hmm.
And preferably, that is a customer problem. You
Okay.
put your customer mindset on and understand the dilemma from their perspective. Customers are solving solutions that are solving for solutions for problems typically they have inside, not necessarily outside. So really, there's two parts to this. Is it an internal problem? That problem should stem from a customer problem. We can't get a service to the customer, or we can't provide a product. What is in our way? Or it's a customer problem where you try to understand what problem they're trying to solve, and can you do it the most efficient and effective way. The oldest story around this is in the space program, where the U.S. The problem was, how do you write in space? The U.S. made the assumption that it would be ink. So therefore, you had to develop a pen that would operate in zero gravity. The Russian response was a pencil.
Which I love.
Okay, so again, it's what problem are you trying to solve? And going back to our sort of our thesis, if you do a bunch of horizoning, if you look out there and you ask yourself, without the constraints of the industry orthodoxy boxes, What else could we do? It might lead you to the pencil. And I think that's, part of where they have to start before they start gathering the data. What problem are you trying to solve? That might tell you what data you need to acquire.
So that reminds me of a
So are you
conversation I
therefore
had this.
saying,
Go on, Marcus.
sorry, go on. So are you therefore saying that, because obviously I love that when you start with the customer as a service designer or design thinker, because I always take the customer and behavior first, because if the customer behavior doesn't exist, you don't have a business, right?
Right.
So, but a lot of transformation projects are built on the fact of upgrading digital ecosystems, not as a customer value first, is always business value first in terms of efficiency instead of effectiveness towards customer value, right?
Right.
So would you actually say it's always customer value first whenever someone wants to grow and go further out? Or is therefore tech less of a driver now for margins essentially? Is that something we could say, or what's your opinion on that?
Well, that's interesting. There's always the drive for efficiency because it's directly related to cost. If I can take a step out, reduce time, whatever it is. In a previous life, I built wwk.com, which we developed all the cost of ownership software for the semiconductor industry. And if there's anything we learned there, it's you take out steps, you take out cost. And automation does that, other things do that. The efficiency focus, I think, sometimes as you get more complex issues, can backfire on you in the sense that you pursue it with a degree of singularity that comes back to haunt you or bite you because you didn't understand the customer's world. And I'll give you a real life example. One of the customers I had at one point in my career was Intel, and we had improved our process and therefore improved the product. We were able to, show that, our process improvement allowed us to save, some time and some money. We were willing to pass that along with a much narrower range of on a yield curve of product. We spent all that time and money gaining efficiency, but we never asked the customer. In this case, it was copy exact whether or not our efforts would be rewarded. And they weren't, because until at the time felt that they had a chaotic process and that anytime you try and change something in a chaotic process, you get more chaos. Therefore, do not change what you're delivering to us. Totally counterintuitive, totally not known, but we didn't take the time to explore the customer's mindset before solving the problem.
Yeah, we had the
It's more
same
efficient.
over we had the same over at a banking client where they tried to be more like Monzo and say, oh, we want to be able to have our accounts opening faster. When we did the research, none of the customer cared. So there was no customer value increase on spending lots of money improving that part of the ecosystem. Same thing, yeah. And I think that happens a lot. Again, you stated quite right, and I support that by experience and having seen that I wonder how much the balance needs to be struck between getting more efficient and driving yourself into a efficiency corner and then not being able to move versus effectiveness, which means be able to still do whatever it takes, means still have 10 tools. Don't cookie cutter down to one tool because it's cheaper, but keep yourself resilient and flexible because the next different thing will come. What are your thoughts sort of on that balance between that? Because I know it's historically really ingrained in every company to be efficient. But is our modern world so fastly shifting that maybe efficiency is less of a thing?
That's a very good point. There's a couple of things that happen there. There's the communications time, which is shrunk. It used to be we sent a messenger from camp to camp, and then we did carrier pigeons, and then horses, and then the telegraph, and now the internet. During that time frame, I don't think humans have evolved to where they still need time to reflect, to understand the nuances and the biases in the information. The problem with sometimes with efficiency is you lose sight of some of that information, and therefore the nuances and the biases that are built in, including what you were going after, which is you narrow your focus so much, or you're so rigid that if that breaks, everything breaks. So if you look at things like, if all we have is a digital currency, watch out if there's a cyber war. right? So you always want to have an analog. You always want to have some other way of doing things, which speaks to some level of resiliency in alternatives that are built into your planning systems and built into sort of your process improvements. There's a level of efficiency beyond which it probably doesn't have a return on investment.
And then COVID comes along and you turn the entire thing on its head because your in person travel to factory to do inspections is suddenly no longer an option and you need a digital backup. You need virtual factory tours. You need those kind of things. So, understanding kind of 3D factory tours, walking tours, those kinds of things, when suddenly your physical, your analog isn't possible. And I found that to be a real shift, an interesting shift in our current times.
Oh, I think it's going to be even more as we look at IoT. We look at connecting the sensors. So now, if you're doing the virtual walkthrough, suppose the data that's coming up is off of the throughputs and efficiencies of the machines and the yield, and what's happening at that process step as you're walking through on your dashboard. It's one thing to walk through, but if there's not data informing you as in your walkthrough, it's a great virtual physical exercise, but it doesn't tell you much unless the rest of the data is also being supplied. So I think you're going to see an expansion there as well, and a rapid one.
Yeah, and that's one of those, if you had the ability to see or to spot those things coming, you as a business leader might have been more prepared than some other businesses for this unforeseen eventuality of a pandemic that curtails, real world travel.
I think that's very true, and I think you may have been looking at it from well, what else could we know, and could we know it on a real time basis rather than an inspection? That might be one question. The other one is, like we said, if you're going out there and horizoning, if you're looking at what else can be done, how else could it be done, and running little experiments. Maybe you only had one little virtual reality in one little corner of a factory that was tied to the internet that you built the visual on and said, that's interesting. I can see the machine working. I can see people on the assembly line. What else do I need to know if I use this? I don't have to roll it out across my 20 plants around the world. I can start with one little corner in one little plant and experiment and see what insights develop. And that's part of our SPX process. Do the experiments, learn the insights, then come up with a program and see if it sticks. So you might roll out a solution in Dallas and it goes really well. You roll it out in Chicago, it rolls really well. You roll it out in Seattle and it dies. You've got a dilemma on your hands. Do you keep it, kill it? What do you do to revise it? On the other hand, if it goes well in Dallas, it goes well in Chicago, it goes well in Seattle, you scale up and make sure you're going to roll out, in New York, Pittsburgh, London, Toronto as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think I'm just looking at the time, and as usual, there's so many questions, so little time. So just gonna ask a last one that might would be right in your ballpark. So we had, when I remember back on our first episode in our podcast, which seems like ages ago, we talked about with our Celia author there about Six Sigma and the whole idea of that it was introduced back in the 90s and around about that time. And one of the big things is to reduce variance, to make something really, really efficient. Six Sigma is still around, I think, because it's a bit of a belief system, of course, or it showed to be very successful, so a lot of people still believe in it. However, and you talked a lot about semiconductors, where this is probably very, very accurate and very, very much still a thing. And we just previously talked about the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. How could you tell the leadership to say, right, Six Sigma was a good idea, had its time, still has its place. Removing variance is a great thing, but variance are essentially a bit like experiments, right? They're different little deviations. And now we need experiments. We need variance and differences to address different customers in a different way, different localities, and in a different way, and have variance of the product. This seems contradictory. How would you tell a leader to go, well, it actually still makes sense, or how do you how do you challenge the contradiction? How do you solve that?
I think there's two things there. One is where is Six Sigma being applied, and where does it work best? And it typically works best in a fixed process, and one that's usually driven by physics. Meaning, you put chemical A with chemical B, you heat them to a certain temperature under a certain pressure, and you get product Y out. And if you maintain those variables very tightly, you get a real consistent output. What you're talking about, in some respects, is trying to apply that to where you have complex interactive networks, or you have people, essentially, where the variable becomes almost infinite in some respects. So you have to allow for variances, or you'll never get the insights. You'll never see the nuances if you try to eliminate them from, I think, again, the context of where you're applying those types of rules, and using Six Sigma, which is largely learning how to do a series of experiments and learning what the data is telling you. I think there's just two different worlds that those apply in. So one, I think, still has efficacy, if you will, in the sort of industrial production world. But I'm not sure it works so well when you start to look at processes that involve humans or have large inherent variability in them.
Yeah, I think that works. Well, for me, that makes perfect sense because I'm trying to score for myself here at this moment, because it fits perfectly into the idea between, a tame and a wicked problem, where a tame problem is this controlled environment you just described, where Six Sigma is a perfect thing for and does really, really well. Whereas you apply that to a wicked problem, which is the more people you have in the mix, the more likely it is a wicked problem. It's uncontrollable. Whatever you put into the system or nudge it, you have no idea how much that changes the outcome. And you can't apply Six Sigma to this because it just doesn't work, which is really interesting, because there's some people arguing that therefore, a scientific and engineering approach that works really well for those mass production Six Sigma type of context just doesn't work on these wicked problems where millions of people are involved and you're trying to figure out how to nudge dynamics and behavior. It's really interesting.
Well, again, I think that's
never heard it that clearly. Yeah.
I think that's the challenge that we have going forward. We are taking these fixed products, and a friend of mine used the term feckless. We sort of launched the products with no idea their ramifications. I'm a great proponent of modeling, and we do very little about modeling the adoption of technologies. We just launch them and go, hey, it's selling. Hallelujah.
Yeah.
But what are the ramifications? And, really, I think that's the next step, is to be able to, all right, we're going to launch this product. If it gets this type of adoption, what are the possible applications and use case for this technology?
As opposed to the endless faffing of feckless fools.
Yeah. Well, I mean, our ethics were built around observable behaviors, right? So you could assign responsibility in that environment, to say, hey, I saw Sally hit Fred, and that was wrong. And so there was an ethical violation. Well, there's two things happening there. One is it's in the same time frame, and two, it's observable. When we launch new technologies, A, it's not always in the same time frame because the adoption rate happens in the future. And B, right, we're not in the same physical space. We can't observe it when we launch it. So it gets very challenging, I think, and it's one of the things that we are going to have to start looking at a little more carefully as we get into, gene modification and a few other things that are on the horizon.
Yeah, and I think as we declared earlier, we're not going to slide into an ethics conversation here. Plus, our time we're looking at the time here, so
Yeah.
I'll just say, obviously, there's more questions. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the book. It's really great talking to you, Michael. So I say thank you so much for your time and for your insights.
Thank you, Marcus and Troy. It was just a delight. Thank you.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.